With the upcoming releases of the Panasonic GH6 and the OM systems, OM1 cameras, it re-sparks the conversation of, should you get yourself a Micro Four Thirds camera? Is the Micro Four Thirds dead? Or if you just go for a full frame camera like everyone else? And as someone who owns both cameras and lenses on both of these systems, in my opinion, it's a little bit of a complicated issue because it's not just as simple as oh, Micro Four Thirds is dead or full frame is, better or whatever. I think they both have their benefits and their, downsides. So in this video, we're going to be going over which one of these systems you should buy and which one's going to be the best one for you. So when I first started in photography and videography, I actually started with the Micro Four Thirds cameras. Like this was the camera I started with, which is the Panasonic G7 camera. And then from there, I upgraded to the GH5, which I used for a couple of weeks, but I just wasn't that happy with that camera that much because even though it had like a lot of great video features of the camera, and the thing I didn't like about the camera is that, at the time I spent around $2,500 for the camera. So from upgrading the G7 to the GH5, when it comes to the photography side of things, it just didn't feel like it was an upgrade. Like I think I went from 16 to 20 megapixels. And again, that wasn't that big of an upgrade. The autofocus wasn't that much better on that camera, but there was a lot of extra, video features of the camera, which was really nice. But I just didn't like it that much, so I ended up returning the camera. And then I got my first mirrorless full frame camera, which was the Sony a7R III right over here. Now, after I got this camera, then I end up, investing heavily into Sony cameras and lenses. Now I own a Sony a7R III, the original a7, a7 IV that we're shooting with right now, and a Sony FS5 that I use for more of my serious videography work. So does that mean Micro Four Thirds is not worth investing into? And that's, again, a complicated question because it really depends on what you do. For example, I still use the Panasonic G7 even to this day because guess what? It's a really small camera that you can just, you can even put this in your pocket. Like, for example, I can just take this lens off right here, and this right here is a 45 1.8 lens. So when you factor in the crop factor, this 90mm 3.6 lens. And if we compare it to something like this, which is the Sony 85mm 1.8, if we take the lens hood off of this also, you can see that it's a lot smaller and lighter build that you have. Again, this is a 1.8. Well, this is technically a 3.6. And it's kind of a debated topic on, if you should double the aperture of the camera or not. But in my opinion, you should because you don't get the same results out of this lens as you do out of this one. So if you don't want to watch this whole video, I'm pretty much going to say if you're a hobbyist, honestly, the Micro Four Thirds cameras are a great option because it's just a lot smaller and lighter package. And even though the cameras themselves aren't that much smaller, you can get like pretty small full frame or like APC, cameras. As you can see, this is an R3 that's 42 megapixels and this G7 that's 16 megapixels. And they're around the same size. And the reason for that is because of ergonomics, If you made these cameras even smaller than what they are, and you can get smaller ones, it just becomes uncomfortable to hold in the hand. So you kind of are limited to, as pretty much small as this can be. You're not going to get much smaller than this unless if you want to, give up the ergonomics of the camera. But yeah, so if you're just a hobbyist, I think the Micro Four Thirds cameras are great. If you just want to walk around the town or if you're going hiking or anything, I think Micro Four Thirds makes a lot of sense. And that's what I reuse most of the time. I don't bring full frame cameras with me if I'm going hiking or something. But if you're a professional photographer, honestly, I'm just going to say go for a full frame camera. I know around like 30 professional photographers that, do studio work, shoot weddings, events, portraits, wildlife. Pretty much all the professional photographers use full frame cameras, and mainly from either Sony or Canon. And I know literally only one Nikon shooter, and this might be because we're all friends, so we influence each other. And I know I made multiple photographers buy Sony cameras just because I love these cameras, so I tell people to buy them. But when it comes to professional photography, full frame, there is a big difference between Micro Four Thirds and full frame. And if you do professional video work, it's the same. I think full frame nowadays is a lot more affordable and you just get more for your money. I think it's a complicated issue, so I'm going to tell you guys why I feel that way. Now, the first problem I have with Micro Four Thirds cameras isn't what you think it is. It isn't, depth of field, or it isn't the crop factor, it isn't the low light performance or whatever. The main problem I have is economics. Now, what I mean by economics is how much money is being made by these cameras. Now, when it comes to Micro Four Thirds cameras, there's only two real players, which is Panasonic, and previously it was Olympus. And Olympus obviously went out of business. They got bought up by OM Systems because there just isn't enough money being made from Micro Four Thirds cameras. Olympus went out of business, and Panasonic actually started making full-frame cameras. Now, this is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy because there isn't enough people buying these Micro Four Thirds cameras, and since there's enough people buying these cameras, camera companies are going out of business. They're making less of these cameras, so there's less money being made by these cameras. So there's less money going into developing technologies for these cameras. So at the end of the day, you just get a worse product. But when you look at full frame, for example, that's all the cameras everyone's buying. I know so many people that just bought a new full frame camera. They bought a Nikon Z5, A7 III, or the new Canon R5, R6. Everyone's just buying full frame cameras because they're such a good deal right now compared to what you get at a Micro Four Thirds. And you have big players playing in the full frame field. You got Canon, for example, which has been the biggest camera company since like the 80s. You get Nikon, which also has been the second biggest company since the 80s. And then you have Sony also, which is now becoming the biggest camera company. And as you might know, Sony does a bunch of other stuff besides, just making cameras. So these companies have a lot of money, so they can pour a lot of money into research. That's why you're seeing, all these new advancements in technology, where you're seeing these crazy autofocusing systems on these Sony and Canon cameras, just because there's more money going into it. So you're just not gonna have as good as technology in these Micro Four Thirds cameras. But again, maybe when the OM1 comes out, maybe it'll have better autofocus than this A7 IV camera. And maybe when the Panasonic GH6 comes out, maybe it's, contrast based detect autofocus is better than this camera. But we'll see, I guess. You might ask yourself, why do I care how much money my camera company makes? And the reason why you should care is because buying a camera is kind of like making an investment, especially if you're a professional. These are cameras that you're probably going to be using for at least 3, 4, 5 years, and the lenses you're probably going to use maybe like a decade or two. Because when you buy into a camera system, you kind of are stuck. You can always sell all your lenses and move on to another system. But I own like 10 different Sony lenses. If I want to get myself a Canon R5 or something, selling all those lenses and then buying, the similar lenses for Canon, it would just be a complete pain in the ass, and I would lose so much money doing that, for example. So when you invest money into a company, when you buy their cameras and lenses, you want to make sure that in a decade, you're still going to be able to use your cameras and lenses. If your camera breaks, you want to be able to replace it with their, brand new camera. And also, if you buy a camera, you want to make sure there's new and exciting new lenses that are coming out for the camera. With Sony, they're always releasing new cameras and lenses that push the envelope. Well, if you bought something like a Micro Four Thirds camera, they haven't made any new exciting lenses in a really long time. If you're a professional, that's a big reason why you should care if your camera company is actually going to be profitable or not. That's one of the main reasons I went with Sony, is because if Sony's losing money on their cameras or lenses, they're not going to go out of business. Sony sells TVs, they sell, game consoles, they sell bunch of different types of electronics. So with Sony, I'm confident that this camera is not going to go out of business. Well, if you bought an Olympus camera, for example, that camera company went out of business. Now they bought up by OM Systems, and we'll see how they do. And I hope they do a good job. But at the same time, these are big investments you're making. But again, if you're just a hobbyist and you're just buying a camera just for fun, then this is stuff that you don't really have to think about. That's one of the main reasons why I recommend professionals to invest into a nice full frame system, either by Canon or Sony, is because your money is just going to be more secure there. Obviously, that doesn't mean those companies can never go out of business and that Micro Four Thirds can make a comeback or anything, but it's just that if you're just getting into photography or videography, it's just better to invest your money into Sony cameras or Canon cameras, especially with the price being so much more affordable nowadays, that if you buy yourself, professional Sony camera and Sony lenses, it might actually be cheaper than buying a Micro Four Thirds camera and professional lenses on their systems. And that's the thing about Micro Four Thirds cameras and lenses, is that even though you're getting less for your money with those cameras, yes, there's obviously advantages to the size and weight of the Micro Four Thirds cameras, but things that technically you're getting less for your money, but the prices don't really reflect that. For example, if you get yourself a professional Olympus 2.8 lens, that's technically a 5.6, and you compare it with a Sony 2.8 lens, you know, especially if you go third party with those lenses, you can actually get cheaper lenses if you just go with the full frame camera. And when you do that, you're saving money, you're getting a better depth of field with your footage, and Sony just has better autofocus than, you know, like look at this. Look at this beauty right here, just perfectly keeping me in focus. But you're just getting better technologies to begin with. So if a professional comes up to me and they want to do this as a living, I pretty much always recommend people just get a Sony camera. Now, does that mean there's no reason to buy a Micro Four Thirds camera if you want to be a professional photographer or videography? And that's not true. Obviously, there's a lot of people that use Micro Four Thirds cameras. You know, besides the obvious of, you know, Micro Four Thirds cameras being smaller and lighter, there's a bunch of other benefits to these cameras. If you're doing studio photography, if you're doing portraits, or if you're doing product photography, you can pretty much use any camera nowadays. Since you're going to be shooting at the base ISO, it doesn't really matter which camera you use. So for those stuff, if you prefer to use a Micro Four Thirds camera, you can totally do that. And if you also just look at the specs of the Micro Four Thirds cameras, since they have a smaller sensor, it allows you to pretty much, you know, be able to put more specs in there. So for example, when you look at something like the GH5, which came out back in 2017, that camera could shoot in 4K 60 frames per second, which is what the Sony a7 IV can do now, and it's 2022. It took full frame 4 to 5 years in order to catch up to the GH5. That's how revolutionary that camera was. So if you just, you know, care about the raw specs, you know, being able to, you know, shoot in 4K 60, and now the GH6 is going to be able to do 4K 120 frames per second, which again is something that the Sony a7S III can do full frame already. So as you can see, like back in the day, you know, since more people were buying Micro Four Thirds cameras because that was, you know, the hot technology, there were these, you know, technology advancements that were being made. But nowadays, since most of the money is going to full frame, that's where a lot of technology is happening. But we'll see, you know, the GH6 I believe can do 6K 60 frames per second. So if that's something you care about, that's the camera that can do it. But again, if you look at something like the A1, that can do 8K 30 frames per second. But again, that's a lot more expensive than the GH6, but that's in a different ball field. But honestly, if you're a hobbyist, then honestly, I would recommend you get yourself a Micro Four Thirds camera. Now, I love my full frame cameras. I think they're great and everything. But things that if I'm doing something like, if I'm just walking around the town with my girlfriend, or if I'm just, you know, going for hiking or anything, it's better to just have a smaller, lighter setup that you actually want to bring with you. Because I know so many people that, you know, bought themselves a full frame camera just so they can like shoot wildlife with. So they got themselves like a Nikon D850 with a Tamron 150 600 millimeters. Yes, I'm talking about one specific person. But yeah, so they buy these cameras and then they just end up never using these cameras because they're big, they're bulky. And even if the camera itself is small, the full frame lenses always end up being a lot bigger. Now there are smaller and lighter full frame lenses that are coming around. So that's something that's also starting to change. So even though I still do recommend that you get a Micro Four Thirds camera if you're a hobbyist, just because you have a smaller, lighter setup that you actually would want to use. Another thing about the Micro Four Thirds cameras, and specifically the Olympus cameras, is that they have great stabilization, which the Sony cameras don't do. You know, right now I'm using active stabilization when I'm walking, and you know, it does a pretty good job, but I'm telling you, the Olympus is another step above that. And also with the Olympus cameras, they have amazing weather sealing. So if you're in any harsher, you know, weather conditions, if you're like shooting in the rain or hiking and you get, you know, water or mud on your camera, you're gonna know that your camera is gonna be fine. And again, the Sony cameras are supposed to be weather sealed, same with the Canon cameras, but it's something that they don't really advertise that much. But if you look at something like Olympus, they'll show videos of them, you know, docking their camera in water or like spraying them with water to show you how durable these cameras are, which the other camera companies just don't do. And also, if you're a professional and you're doing, for example, a documentary work, or you're doing photography work in harsh conditions, like if you're going to Antarctica to take pictures of, you know, seals mating or something, or if you're trying to shoot a documentary in like a rainforest, then it's better to have a camera like the Olympus cameras, where, you know, these are really well weather sealed cameras and lenses. So you know that, you know, if you get water, if you get rain or whatever in your camera is going to work fine, and you don't have to worry about, you know, your camera dying or whatever. And also, if you're going to be backpacking with these cameras, you know, if you're going to bring a bunch of cameras and lenses with you, then it's better to just have a lighter setup, a smaller lenses. And even if you get, you know, don't get as much depth of field, like who cares, just tell a good story and people will like yourself. If your background's more blurry with the full frame cameras, no one's gonna give a shit, you know. What's really gonna set your stuff apart is going to be, you know, your lighting, your storytelling, those stuff that actually matter will make a big difference. While the camera you use, the depth of field or whatever, that's not going to make a huge difference. So in the end, I don't even know if I answered the question, honestly. I think it's very complicated. I think both of these camera systems have a place in the industry. I think when it comes to getting more with your money, I think the full frame cameras, especially Sony with its third-party lenses like these, you know, Tamron lenses, which I absolutely love. You know, you get such a good deal out of them. And these lenses are very light, very small, and also you just get, especially with lenses like from Tamron, for example, like this is a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, and it's honestly is not that big. And this lens is, you know, very high quality. It's very light, and also it's very cheap to buy. So when it comes to these lenses and cameras, I think, you know, if you go with a Sony full frame camera, I think you'll be getting the best bang for your buck. So if you're a hobbyist, I think the most important part about getting yourself a, you know, a mirrorless or a DSLR camera is actually using these cameras instead of your phone. So making it convenient for yourself and bringing like a small camera is a big deal, because if you buy yourself a big camera, like you get yourself a Sony a7R III, for example, with a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, you know, you have a setup that's like this big, you know. This is not a pocketable camera that you're going to be able to bring with you. So just because of the size alone, you might not bring it with you. So it's better to have a camera that you would actually bring with you. If you go on a hike or something, you can just bring a small light lens like this and a camera, and you can take some great professional looking images with it. Especially if you go with an Olympus camera, you get amazing features like they have live ND. You can also make it so that the camera takes multiple images, combines them, and you get like a high resolution image out of it. They have amazing image stabilization. There's so many great things about, you know, Olympus cameras that I'm actually thinking about buying some just so I can use it for my personal use. But yeah, so it's a complicated issue. Pretty much all I'm going to say is that if you're a professional, get yourself a full frame camera. Unless if you... So in the end, I'm pretty much going to say, if you're a professional, get yourself a full frame, preferably a Sony camera. Unless if you go on to the rainforest or whatever, if you're one of these maniacs that, you know, like to risk their lives while you're trying to shoot a documentary or taking photos. If you're those maniacs, get yourself an Olympus camera. But if you're a hobbyist, I think it's better to just get yourself a Micro Four Thirds camera, unless if you buy the newer full frame cameras that have these, you know, smaller, lighter lenses. But again, Micro Four Thirds lenses are still a little bit smaller and lighter, so I prefer these just for like walking around cameras. So yeah, I don't know if I answered the question or not, but that's it for this video. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe to my channel. I make videos every single week, so make sure to subscribe. And if you have any questions about these cameras or whatever, or what camera or lens to buy, make sure to let me know in the comments below. I try to reply to every single comment I get. But anyways guys, I'll see you guys in the next video, and goodbye.